This lecture is a very short one and is about how the Quran began and its overall impact, very, very briefly. In this lecture, I will focus on just two things. First, the very beginnings of the Quran, the very first encounter of the Prophet Muhammad with the Quranic revelation. Secondly, the initial impact the Quran had on the region, very briefly. Here are some of the images of the book, the Quran, or the Holy Quran, that we'll be focusing on in this subject. Let us now listen to the very first chapter or surah of the Quran. It is a very short one with only 7 verses. Its translation is provided here on the slide. We will come back to the Quran in a minute. Before we get into the details, let us look at this map of Arabia. This is where the Quran began, in particular Mecca, here in western part of Arabia. And Medina, of course, is very important for Islam because that's where the Prophet Muhammad spent the last 10 years of his life. But he began his mission in Mecca. That's where the Quran also began. This image shows you how the surrounding areas of Mecca would have been in earlier times. There are no trees or rivers, just mountains and rocks. This image of Mecca is a modern one. In fact, it's today what Mecca looks like, with lots of buildings, but still no sign of trees or vegetation. What you see here is the sacred mosque in Mecca, and at the center of this mosque is the Kaaba, the most sacred place for Muslims. This is the Kaaba, the black-looking building in Mecca to which Muslims turn towards when they perform their daily prayers 5 times a day. Muslims believe that this Kaaba was built by Abraham and his son Ismail. This is a hill or mountain just outside Mecca. It has a very famous cave called the Cave of Hira, Hira. For our purposes in this subject, this cave is very important. This is really the entrance to that cave, Cave of Hira. It is in this cave the Quran or the Holy Quran, the book that we are focusing on in this subject, begins. Let me start off with a short story. Let us go back to the early 7th century of the Christian calendar, roughly 1400 years back. The place is this cave just outside Mecca. A man sits alone meditating in this dark cave. He is a middle-aged man. He is 40 years old. He is a businessman or a trader. He spends some time away from his business, his family, and the issues of the town. He appreciates solitude. He is currently enjoying the peace that this isolated place offers him, away from busy life in business. A short distance away is the small town where he lives and works. He has escaped the activities of the town for a short while. He prefers sitting quietly in this cave, relaxing, meditating, and reflecting. He is thankful for the silence and the solitude. Suddenly, a voice interrupts the silence. He hears the Arabic word "Iqra", which means recite, echoing through the cave. He is puzzled. He did not know what was happening. Again, the word recite comes from somewhere, this time as an authoritative command. And with the voice, he has a sense of being suddenly held tightly by someone. Yet he is alone. He is overwhelmed by fear. He is too afraid to struggle or utter a sound. What is happening? He waits, desperate for this to pass. Again, the command comes, recite. As it rings out a third time, he cries out, But what shall I recite? Or I do not know what to recite. Then he hears the words and he hears himself echoing them. This is the translation of those few verses. Recite in the name of your Lord who created humans from a clot of blood. Recite, for your Lord is the most generous, who taught by the pen, taught human beings what they did not know. Chapter 96, verses 1 to 5. This was a total shock for him. He never experienced such a thing. He wonders if he's going mad. Is he possessed by some evil forces? So, who is this man? His name is Muhammad. He was born in or around 570 or 571 of the Christian calendar in the town of Mecca in Arabia. Muhammad, who would later be known as Prophet Muhammad, was overwhelmed by the strangeness of the experience in the cave. He was afraid. He leaves the cave and rushes back to his home and his wife, whose name is Khadijah. This is a note that when Muslims mention the name of Muhammad or Prophet Muhammad, they will often say Prophet Muhammad and they will add a little prayer, peace be upon him. It's considered impolite or disrespectful to say just Muhammad or even Prophet Muhammad without saying peace be upon him. But if one has to repeat the name of Prophet Muhammad many times, say in a lecture like this, it is fine to say Prophet Muhammad. Khadijah, his wife, reassures Prophet Muhammad. She says God would never do anything bad to him. She reminds him of his kindness, generosity towards people who are less fortunate. She then takes Prophet Muhammad to her cousin, a Christian who was blind. But this cousin was aware of Christian scriptures. He was a Christian himself. The cousin declares that Prophet Muhammad's vision in the cave is consistent with similar experiences of prophets before. Perhaps Muhammad is a prophet, says the cousin. That's not the end of the story. Rather, it is just the beginning of Muhammad's life as a prophet. As you will have guessed, this is how the story begins. Prophet Muhammad's encounter with the divine or God through the first command to recite in the cave. It is through words or language. This command to recite, sometimes translated as read, was to launch a new world religion in Arabia and beyond. Islam, this new world religion, had entered world history. It was the year 610 of the Christian calendar. That is the beginning of Islam and also the Qur'an, the book which we will be focusing on in this subject. Let us look at the immediate impact of the Qur'an on the region in Arabia and the surrounding region. With this event, a new monotheism had been declared. Of course, monotheism, that is, the belief in one God, existed before this new religion. In that region in Arabia, Jews and Christians as followers of monotheism existed. There were plenty of Jews and Christians in Arabia as well. Meanwhile, Muhammad became known as the Prophet or the Prophet Muhammad, leader of a new monotheistic movement in the little town of Mecca. His followers believed, as indeed they still do, that the Quran had come directly from God to humanity through the human agency of Prophet Muhammad. The crucial element, the divine element in the story was the Quran itself. With this, Prophet Muhammad began to teach a new religion called Islam. He continued to receive messages throughout the rest of his life over a 22-year period from 610 to 632 of the Christian calendar, according to Muslim belief. The number of his followers increased gradually and his message spread from Mecca to various parts of Arabia. Many became his followers or Muslims, and many others objected to his teachings and fought against him and his followers. But in the last 10 years of his life, his teachings spread rapidly. By the time of his death in 632 of the Christian calendar, his teachings spread to many parts of Arabia. After his death, his message was taken by his followers in Arabia to people outside Arabia. This was largely through the initiation of a series of confrontations with the two major powers or empires to the north of Arabia. By this time, Muslims had established a quasi-state in Arabia centered in Medina, where Prophet Muhammad lived the last 10 years of his life. Let us look at how the Quran influenced the region, again very briefly. Just outside Arabia, to the north, there were two major empires, the superpowers at the time in that part of the world. The Byzantine Empire to the northwest, which was largely Christian, and the Sassanid Empire to the northeast of Arabia, which was largely Zoroastrian. Both of them had been fighting each other for centuries. Little did the Byzantine Christians in the north, also preaching monotheism, realize what was coming, nor did the Persians in the northwest of Arabia. After the Prophet Muhammad's death, Muslim armies came in conflict with the two most powerful forces in that region at the time, that is, the Byzantine Empire and also the Sassanid Empire. Within a short period of the Prophet's death, Muslim Arab armies moved into areas that we know today as Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, Israel, Iraq, Iran, and so forth. They also moved to Egypt and North Africa. The Sassanid or Persian Empire was completely defeated very soon after the Prophet's death, and the Byzantine Empire was largely defeated, not entirely. The Muslims moved into North Africa, and only it is the Atlantic Ocean that stopped them. In the east, they continued to move towards India and Central Asia. By the end of the 7th century of the Common Era, this is less than 100 years or so after the death of the Prophet, Muslims were ruling a vast empire, or as Muslims refer to it, caliphate, stretching from North Africa to Central Asia to borders of India. This is just the political and military impact. It was going to have major consequences on the intellectual, economic, social, cultural, and religious front of these regions. We will not be covering these in this lecture. So, what was the nature of this expansion, or the expansion of Islam into these regions? Or another way of asking this question is, what was the nature of these conquests? Was this expansion about forcing Islam onto people of the region, or something else? There are, of course, different ways of looking at such major historical events. What I am providing here is just one view. It is a view that is shared by many Muslims. The rise of Muslims as a powerful force in Arabia was bound to come to the attention of the two empires to the north. Before Islam, Arabia had a large number of tribes, often at war with each other. There was no unifying force as such in Arabia. There was no single state as such in Arabia in the 6th century. There was no threat to the empires then from Arabia. But under the banner of Islam, much of Arabia had become a force that could challenge these two empires. Sooner or later, these empires to the north would come into conflict with the new force emerging from Arabia. That's exactly what happened. Conflicts on the borders of these two empires began very early on, just 1 year or so after the death of Prophet in 632. Early skirmishes between Muslims and the border regions of these two empires led to a full-scale confrontation with both empires very soon. Very quickly, the Arab Muslim forces largely defeated both empires. The territories those empires controlled came under the Muslim rule, now centered in Medina. But what is interesting is that Muslim rulers of the new territories did not require the inhabitants to convert to Islam or to become Muslim. The new Muslim rulers allowed the people to maintain their religions, Christianity, Judaism, or Zoroastrianism, much like they were under the previous empires. So this expansion need not be seen as a mission to convert the people of the region to Islam. Rather, it is probably more of a political and military exercise, part of the expansion of the emerging Muslim power in Arabia. Very much the result of a power struggle between the new Muslim forces emerging from Arabia and the existing powers in the region. While there were some major battles between the Muslim forces and the forces of the two empires, many cities and towns in those regions came under the control of Muslims as a result of peace agreements between the towns and the Muslim armies. Often the terms of the agreements included freedom of religion for the people of the town, certain taxes to be paid to the Muslim state, in many cases similar to the taxes that the people were paying in the previous empires, protection of persons, property, and places of worship. These terms were pretty standard across the board. There may be particular situations or circumstances that might lead to some variation, but the terms were pretty standard. As part of the advance of Islam, most of the conquered peoples underwent a process of what we might call enculturation, or in other words, Arabization. Over the course of the first 100 years or so, Arabic language had become the language of the Muslim caliphate or empire. Muslims often use the term caliphate, not empire. Even those who were living under the umbrella of the caliphate, who were not Muslim, were also influenced by the Islamic culture and Arabic language. Arabic language would become the language of scholars, philosophers, scientists, theologians in much of what we today call the Middle East, Central Asia, and North Africa, and even Southern Europe from the 8th and 9th centuries of the Christian calendar. This map shows the influence of Islam very much in the first 100 or 150 years or so after the death of the Prophet. This is really the political influence of Muslims. Their caliphate expanded from southern Europe to the borders of India. But the vast majority of people in these regions did not become Muslim until 200 years or so after the death of the Prophet. So very briefly, I have covered in this lecture how the Quran began and very briefly the impact the Quran had on the region. This is just by way of introduction. Thank you for watching. Stay tuned for more lectures in this series as we explore the Quran's history, themes, and interpretation